Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine you're a young democracy, barely, 2 decades old, and the leader, the one who really guided you through independence, set the whole course, suddenly gone. What happens next? That was the really intense question facing India in the mid-1960s.
It really was. And it wasn't just, who comes next. That was the immediate thing. Sure, after Nehru, who? But the much deeper, sort of more anxious question everyone was asking, inside India and outside too, was, after Nehru, what?
Right.
Would this whole democratic experiment actually, survive? A lot of people were looking at India's problems, massive poverty, inequality, all the divisions, and they were frankly skeptical, deeply skeptical.
Yeah, there was this real sense of fragility, wasn't there? The 1960s, this period, people even called it the dangerous decade because of all these huge unresolved issues. The fear was India wouldn't manage a peaceful transition. Maybe, disintegration, maybe the military steps in. Real fears.
And the material we're looking at today for this deep dive, it takes us right through this incredibly pivotal time. It basically tracks the story right from Nehru's passing through those first, maybe surprising successions. Then the big challenges that popped up for Congress, opposition getting its act together, internal splits becoming critical, the huge political shifts in the late 60s, and then how the party, under new leadership, managed to claw its way back to dominance. But, and this is key, in a way that really changed its fundamental nature.
Okay, so that's our mission then, to really understand these successions, look at how that opposition unity and the internal party fighting shook up the Congress system, see how Indira Gandhi rose to meet it all, and basically grasp what this whole intense chapter tells us about, how Indian politics evolved. Let's jump in.
Right. So the first big test hits basically the moment Nehru passes away, May 1964. And maybe, surprisingly for all those critics who doubted India's stability, the transition was remarkably smooth.
It really was, wasn't it? The Congress president back then, K. Kamraj, seems like he played a really vital part, building consensus behind the scenes.
Absolutely. He managed the situation really well. And that consensus, it pretty quickly settled on Lal Bahadur Shastri. He was chosen unanimously by the Congress MPs, became the next prime minister.
In Shastri, he was seen as a safe pair of hands?
Kind of. Non-controversial, definitely. A senior minister from UP, known for being simple, principled. You remember the story about him resigning as railway minister over an accident.
Right, taking moral responsibility. That says a lot.
It does. And Nehru himself had apparently relied on him quite a bit near the end.
But his time as PM, 64 to 66, it was incredibly tough going.
Oh, absolutely. India was still feeling the economic hit from the China War. Then you had monsoon failures, drought, a really bad food crisis. And on top of all that, the 1965 war with Pakistan.
Yeah, brutal couple of years.
And it's in that context he gives that famous slogan, Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, hail the soldier, hail the farmer, really captured the mood, the dual challenges.
A powerful slogan. But his tenure, it ended so abruptly.
Tragically short. He died in Tashkent, January 66, literally right after signing the peace agreement with Pakistan.
So just like that, Congress is facing succession again, less than 2 years later, and this time the material suggests it wasn't so smooth.
No, this time it was much more competitive, intense, really. The main figures who emerged were Morarji Desai, very experienced, former chief minister, central minister, and Indira Gandhi. Nehru's daughter, yes, but also a former Congress president, and she'd been a minister under Shastri, too.
And the party leadership, the senior figures, they leaned towards Indira.
Initially, yeah, many of the top leaders did, but it wasn't a done deal. It actually went to a secret ballot among the Congress MPs.
Oh, okay.
And Indira Gandhi won that quite decisively, got more than 2/3 of the votes.
But the fact they settled it with a vote, even with that competition, that itself was seen as positive.
Very much so. It was seen as a sign that India's democracy was, maturing, able to handle internal competition peacefully. The source even mentions a Lundy newspaper, The Guardian, commenting on it, saying India handled its succession with more dispatch and much more dignity than Britain was managing its own leadership issues around them.
Wow, that's quite a comparison.
Yeah.
So Indira Gandhi takes over. Now, she was politically active, obviously, but maybe less experienced in the day-to-day running of government compared to Desai.
Right. And the senior leaders who backed her, this informal group they called the syndicate.
Ah, yes, the syndicate.
They probably expected her to rely on them quite heavily because of that relative inexperience. They guide things.
But she walked straight into massive problems. The economy was getting worse.
Yeah, considerably worse. And she had to face a general election within just a year. So faced with all that, her main goal became pretty clear pretty quickly. She had to get control of the party, show she was her own leader.
Which sets the stage perfectly for 1967. The material calls it a landmark year, first election without Nehru. And the backdrop just sounds incredibly difficult.
Oh, it was. Think about it. 2 PM's gone in less than 2 years. A new leader seen as maybe a bit inexperienced, and this deep economic crisis brewing.
What were the main factors there?
You had back-to-back monsoon failures, so widespread drought, agriculture tanking, severe food shortages. Then foreign exchange reserves were drying up, industrial production dropped, exports fell, plus defense spending was still high after the wars.
So resources were stretched incredibly thin.
Exactly. And then adding fuel to the fire just before the elections, the government devalued the rupee quite significantly, apparently under pressure from, the U.S. and World Bank.
Devaluation, that always hits hard.
It did. The cost of a U.S. dollar jumped from under 5 rupees to over 7, and that, naturally, led to prices rising across the board.
Which means public anger.
Palpable discontent. You saw protests, bans, hurdles, shutdowns, strikes against rising prices, food shortages, unemployment. It became really common.
And how did the government react?
Often, unfortunately, by treating them just as law and order problems, not really as, genuine expressions of suffering. And that just made people more bitter.
And on top of the economic stuff, there were other movements.
Yeah, you had communist and socialist groups pushing harder, agrarian struggles flaring up, even Hindu-Muslim riots adding to the tension. It was just a really volatile mix, perfect conditions for a political shakeup.
Absolutely. And the opposition parties, they saw their chance in all this.
They did. They finally had this, collective realization. Mm-hmm. The main reason Congress kept winning, even with falling vote shares, was because they were always divided. Their votes were split.
So what was the plan?
Simple, really.
Yeah.
Start forming anti-Congress fronts in the states. Make deals, adjust seats, basically gang up. They saw Indira Gandhi's perceived inexperience and the obvious divisions within Congress, the syndicate tensions, were already there as a huge opportunity.
And this is where non-Congressism comes in.
Exactly. The idea was really pushed by the socialist leader, Ram Manohar Lohia. He gave it an intellectual backbone, arguing Congress rule had become undemocratic. It was against the poor.
Right.
So uniting all the non-Congress parties wasn't just tactics, he argued. It was necessary to, quote, reclaim democracy for the people.
Powerful framing.
Yeah.
So, crisis, discontent, opposition strategy, all leading into the 67 elections.
Yeah.
And the results.
Well, the source calls it a political earthquake, and it really was. It jolted Congress badly at both the national and state levels.
Okay, so nationally, Lok Sabha.
Congress did get a majority, but only just. It was their lowest number of seats and their lowest vote share since the very first election back in 52. And maybe, more tellingly, half of Indira Gandhi's cabinet ministers lost their seats.
Wow, half the cabinet.
Yeah. And big names, too.
Yeah.
Political heavyweights like Kamaraj himself, S.K. Patil, Atulya Ghosh, they all lost in their own constituencies.
That must have sent shockwaves. This is when people started talking about India's democracy failing.
Exactly. Observers like Neville Maxwell wrote about India's disintegrating democracy. That phrase really captured the feeling that maybe the whole experiment was crumbling.
But the real shocker was at the state level.
Oh, absolutely. That's where the change was just unprecedented. Congress lost its majority outright in 7 states. 7. And then in 2 more, defections after the elections stopped them from forming a government. So in total, 9 states across India slipped from Congress control.
9 states. Which ones were they?
It was a huge swath of the country: Punjab, Haryana, UP, Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, West Bengal, Orissa, down south to Madras and Kerala.
Good grief, the source mentions that saying about the train journey.
Yeah, that you could get on a train in Delhi and travel all the way to Howrah near Calcutta without passing through a single state ruled by Congress. Just imagine that after decades of near total dominance.
Incredible. And Madras state, Tamil Nadu, that was unique.
It was. The regional party there, the DMK Dravida Munnetra Kazhagam, they won a clear majority all by themselves. First time ever a non-Congress party pulled that off in a state. Their leadership in the anti-Hindi protests was a big factor there.
And in the other 8 states, Coalitions.
Yep. Non-Congress parties banded together to form coalition governments, often called Samyukt Vidhayak Dals or SVDs.
And these coalitions, they weren't exactly natural allies.
Far from it. The source calls them ideologically incongruent, which is putting it mildly. You had situations like in Bihar, where socialists, communists, and the right-wing Jana Sangh were all in the same SVD government.
Strange bedfellows indeed.
Or the Popular United Front in Punjab, which somehow managed to bring together rival Sikh Akali factions, communists, and the Jana Sangh. It really makes you think about that question the source raises.
How about coalitions today?
Yeah. We see hung assemblies and coalition governments all the time now. It feels normal. But back then, this was totally new, totally disruptive. It highlights just how much the political landscape shifted in 67.
Right. And this era also gave us another political term, defection.
Ah, yes, defection. Basically, an elected MLA or MP quitting the party they were elected on to join another one, usually for some kind of gain.
And this became a big deal after 67.
Huge, because in several states, Haryana, MP, UP, are mentioned. It was breakaway Congress legislators defecting after the election who actually enabled the non-Congress SVD governments to be formed or survive.
And this leads to that famous phrase, Aya Ram, Gaya Ram.
The classic story. It comes from Haryana in 1967. An MLA named Gaya Lal apparently switched parties 3 times in about 2 weeks.
3 times?
Yeah, including, legend has it, twice in just 9 hours. So when he finally came back to the Congress fold, the leader who engineered it, Rao Birendra Singh, supposedly presented him to the press and declared, Gaya Ram is now Aya Ram.
Ram who had gone is now Ram who has come. Brilliant.
It just stuck, became the catchphrase for this kind of floor crossing, subject of jokes, cartoons, and eventually it became such a problem with instability that they had to bring in a constitutional amendment, the anti-defection law, to try and control it.
So back at the national level, Congress is still in power after 67, but weaker. Those state coalitions are shaky. But the real threat to Indira Gandhi wasn't just the opposition anymore.
No. The really serious long-term challenge was brewing inside the Congress party itself, a major power struggle.
Enter the syndicate.
Exactly. This informal but very influential group of senior, powerful Congress organizational leaders. People like K. Kamraj, S.K. Patil, the Congress president, S.N. Jalgappa, N. Sanjeeva Reddy, Atulya Ghosh. Mostly powerful state bosses.
And they were the ones who'd helped put Indira Gandhi in power after Shastri.
They were instrumental, and they absolutely expected her to, well, follow their lead, rely on their advice, let them manage party affairs.
But she wasn't having it.
Not at all. She knew she had to assert her own authority, break free from their control, and somehow win back the ground Congress had lost in 67.
So how did she play it?
Very cleverly, actually, and boldly. She didn't just engage in a behind-the-scenes power struggle, she turned it into an ideological battle. She started giving her government's policies a very clear left orientation.
Ah. Okay. Like the 10-point program.
Precisely. That came out in May 67. It included things like calling for social control over banks, nationalizing general insurance, suggesting ceilings on urban property and income, better public food distribution, land reforms, providing housing sites for the rural poor.
So, quite socialist-leaning policies.
Definitely. Now, the syndicate formally approved this program, but they couldn't really oppose it openly, but they had serious reservations. They weren't comfortable with this sharp left turn.
And this tension finally breaks out into the open.
Explodes, really, in 1969. The trigger was the presidential election needed after President Zakir Hussain passed away.
What?
The syndicate made a power play. They nominated N. Sanjeeva Reddy, remember? He was one of Indira's rivals for PM earlier as the official Congress candidate for president, and they did it pretty much ignoring her preferences.
Ouch. How did she react?
With characteristic boldness. She didn't openly oppose Reddy at first, but she quietly encouraged the vice president at the time, V.V. Giri, to stand as an independent candidate. And then, crucially, around the same time, she pushed through 2 hugely popular headline-grabbing policy decisions.
Which were?
The nationalization of 14 major private banks and the move to abolish the privy purse.
Right, the privy purse. Explain that again.
It was basically the special payments and privileges that had been guaranteed to the rulers of the old princely states when they agreed to merge with India back after independence.
A legacy of integration.
Exactly. Maybe necessary then to bring everyone on board smoothly. But over time, these hereditary privileges felt increasingly out of step with the Constitution's principles of equality. Even Nehru apparently wasn't happy with them.
But abolishing them was controversial.
Oh yes. Morarji Desai, who was deputy PM and finance minister then, was strongly against it. He saw it as breaking a promise, a breach of faith with the former princes. But Indira Gandhi saw it as a progressive step, and politically very popular. She pushed it hard, even though initial attempts to get it through parliament or by ordinance failed. It became a major symbolic issue.
So back to the presidential election. The syndicate nominates Reddy. Indira backs Giri indirectly, nationalizes banks, targets the privy purse. How did the vote play out?
High drama. The Congress president, Nijjhalingappa, issued a formal whip and order telling all Congress MPs and MLAs to vote for the official candidate, Reddy. Indira Gandhi's supporters, who are calling themselves the requisitionists because they demanded a party meeting which was refused, they decided to fight back.
Oh.
After initially giving quiet backing to Giri, Indira Gandhi made a dramatic public appeal for a conscience vote. She urged Congress legislators to vote for who they thought was best, not just follow the party line.
A direct challenge to the party leadership.
Absolutely, and it worked. In a stunning result, the independent candidate V.V. Giri won the election. The official Congress candidate, Sanjeeva Reddy, lost.
Wow. The source mentions a cartoon about that.
Yeah, R.K. Laxman's The Left Hook. It shows Giri landing this knockout punch on Nijjhalingappa, who represents the syndicate, perfectly captures the shock and the political blow she delivered.
So what happens after the official candidate loses?
It triggers the final break. The Congress president, Nijjhalingappa, expelled Indira Gandhi from the Congress party for indiscipline.
Expelled the prime minister.
Yes, but she claimed her faction, the requisitionists, was the real Congress. So by November 1969, the split was formal. You had two parties. Congress Organization, or Congress-O, led by the Syndicate Group,
Yeah.
and Congress Requisitionists, or Congress, led by Indira Gandhi.
And how did India frame this split to the public?
Brilliantly, from her perspective. She didn't present it as just a personal power struggle. She framed it as a deep ideological battle. Her side represented socialism, progress, the interests of the poor. The Syndicate, Congress-O, they were painted as conservatives, reactionaries, defenders of the rich, and the status quo.
A very effective narrative.
Extremely. Though the source does include a quote from Nijjhalingappa's letter expelling her, where he voices concern about her becoming a victim of political narcissism surrounded by sycophants. So you get a sense of the bitterness on their side, too.
So after the split, Indira Gandhi's Congress government is actually in a minority in parliament.
Yes. She lost a chunk of MPs to Congress. Her government survived, but it depended on issue-based support from other parties, notably the Communist Party of India, CPI, and the regional DMK from Tamil Nadu.
Not a stable situation long term.
Not at all. She needed to consolidate her position and that reliance on others and get her own clear mandate from the people.
So what was her strategy?
Double down on the socialist image. Push ahead with reforms, especially things like land ceilings, and then a really bold gamble. In December 1970, she recommended dissolving the Lok Sabha more than a year early and called for a fresh general election.
Calling an early election risky. How did things look going into that 1971 campaign?
On the face of it, quite difficult for her Congress. Many observers saw them as just a breakaway faction, maybe lacking the deep organizational roots of the Congress-O, which still had many of the old party bosses.
And the opposition. Did they unite again?
They did. All the major non-communist, non-Congress opposition parties formed what they called the Grand Alliance. This included Congress-O, the Socialist parties, SSP, PSP, the Jana Sangh, the Swatantra Party, the Bharatiya Kranti Dal, BKD. Basically everyone united by their opposition to Indira Gandhi.
So a big coalition against her. Who does she ally with?
Her Congress are mainly allied with the CPI.
So it's Congress R plus CPI versus this Grand Alliance.
Mm-hmm.
How did the campaign play out?
This is where Indira Gandhi really showed her political genius. She had a clear message, a positive agenda, and crucially, a killer slogan. The Grand Alliance, the material points out, really only had one unifying theme: Indira Hatao. Remove Indira.
A negative campaign.
Mostly, yeah. Her counter: simple, direct, and incredibly effective. Garibi Hatao. Remove poverty.
Garibi Hatao. That became legendary.
Absolutely. And she backed it up with a positive program. Focus on the public sector, implement land ceilings, reduce inequality, abolish those pretty purses finally. It was all designed to build this independent support base, specifically targeting the disadvantaged, the landless, Dalits, Adivasis, minorities, women, unemployed youth. She offered them hope.
It does make you think, though, as the source prompts, Garibi Hataao was decades ago, but poverty is still a huge issue in India. Was it just a very effective slogan, a gimmick? Or if it was a real program, why hasn't it fully succeeded? It's a complex question.
It really is. It forces you to think about slogans versus long-term policy impact, and also about that other strategy, non-Congressism. We see alliances forming against dominant parties even today. Was that 60 strategy unique, or are its echoes still around? Things to ponder.
Definitely. So, the 1971 election results, what happened?
A landslide. Absolutely staggering. The Congress RCPI alliance swept the polls. They won way more seats and a bigger vote share than the undivided Congress had ever achieved before.
How many seats?
Together, 375 seats in the Lok Sabha, with about 38.4% of the vote. Indira Gandhi's Congress, on its own, won a massive 352 seats with 44% of the vote. A huge majority.
And the Grand Alliance? Congress O.
Decimated. Congress O, the supposed party of stalwarts, got less than a quarter of the votes Congress got and only won 16 seats. The entire Grand Alliance combined won fewer than 40 seats. It was, as the source says, a grand failure.
Another cartoon reference.
Yes, Laxman again, the grand finish. Shows the opposition leaders completely flattened by the results.
So this victory completely cemented her position.
Totally. Her Congress was now unquestionably the real Congress. She had restored the party's dominant position nationally. And then, events shortly after reinforced her standing even more.
The Bangladesh War.
Exactly. The crisis in East Pakistan, India's intervention, the decisive victory over Pakistan, and the creation of Bangladesh in late 1971. This was seen as a huge triumph for India, and Indira Gandhi's leadership was widely praised. Even opposition leaders admired her statesmanship during the crisis.
So her popularity must have been sky high.
Astronomical, and this wave carried right into the state assembly elections held in 1972. Her party swept nearly all the states, restoring Congress power across the country. She was popular across all sorts of social divides. In just 4 years, she'd gone from facing internal revolt and electoral setbacks to achieving unprecedented dominance.
An incredible turnaround. But here's the crucial point the material raises. Was this really a restoration of the old Congress system? The one that existed under Nehru?
And the source argues pretty strongly, no, it wasn't. It looked similar on the surface. Congress was dominant again, hugely popular. But what Indira Gandhi had actually done was reinvent the party. Its fundamental nature had changed.
Okay, how so? What were the key differences?
Well, first, this new Congress relied almost entirely on the popularity of one supreme leader, Indira Gandhi herself. Second, its internal organization was much weaker than the old party structure. Third, and this is critical, it had far fewer powerful internal factions.
Which meant
It had less capacity to accommodate different opinions, different interests, different regional pressures within the party. The source uses this analogy, asking if it's like changing the top and legs of a table but still calling it the old table. What really stayed the same?
That's a powerful image. The old Congress was famous for being that broad church, absorbing all sorts of views. This sounds much more top-down centralized.
Exactly. And its support base was also different. While the old Congress drew support from almost everywhere, this new Congress relied much more heavily on specific groups, the poor, the marginalized communities like Dalits and Adivasis, minorities, women, the very groups her Garibi Hataao platform had targeted.
So, summing up, she restored Congress dominance, yes, but by changing the very nature of the Congress system itself.
That's the core argument, and the material sort of hints at the longer-term consequences. While Congress power was consolidated and her authority was immense, the space for internal dissent and democratic expression within the wider political system arguably began to shrink. The popular discontent over economic issues didn't just vanish, it continued to simmer and grow, setting the stage for future crises. Crises that, as the source notes, would eventually pose a major threat to constitutional democracy itself. But that's perhaps a story for another deep dive.
What a period, though. We've traced this incredible arc from the uncertainty after Nehru through that shock of 67 when Congress lost so many states, the internal war with the syndicate, the split, and then this massive comeback in 71 and 72 that remade the political map.
But the key takeaway, I think, is that comeback wasn't just a return to the past. The Congress system was dominant again, sure, but it was a different system. More centralized, more dependent on the leader, reliant on a narrower, though still large, social base, and maybe less flexible in handling internal differences compared to its earlier form.
Which leaves us with that final thought from the source material, something for you, the listener, to really mull over. It points to this tension, doesn't it, between a hugely popular, charismatic leader pushing seemingly progressive goals like Garibi Hataao and what that might mean longer term for the health of democratic institutions and the ability of the main political organization to actually manage complex societal tensions. The source points out that even with those huge victories, some felt the Congress Party as an organization, the kind that could absorb dissent and different interests, had fundamentally changed, maybe even, as one quote suggests, effectively died. What does this whole saga tell you about how political power is built, how dominance is maintained, and what the potential trade-offs are when the very character of a country's leading political force undergoes such a profound shift? Something to think about.